Hey folks, happy Friday. Thanks for joining me again now for part 2 of chapter 1. A couple of just quick notes on today. I have noticed that a number of you have commented that you're just listening, which I feel kind of silly about because, this would be a really good format for a podcast. So, I am not going to discontinue the videos, at least not yet, but starting on Monday, I will be publishing this as a podcast, simulcast, whatever, so that you'll be able to download that and just run it out of any of your podcast listeners. Look for this on a podcast service near you. I'm not entirely sure what the name will be, but I will make sure to announce that when the time comes. With a direct link to it down below in the comments. I will also make sure to link it on our friendly Facebook page. So all of that is good stuff. Now to get started, shall we? Okay. Mary never completely recovered. Restless to begin with, she became an insomniac. The older kids would find her wandering around the house at all hours like a soundless wraith. Mary never completely recovered. Restless to begin with, Mary never completely recovered. Restless to begin with, she became an insomniac. The older kids would find her wandering around the house at all hours like a soundless wraith. Once Freddie found her standing at the top of a ladder, painting the hallway in the middle of the night. In the morning, her children sometimes found her unconscious in unexpected places. More than once, she ended up having to go to the hospital. That behavior became part of the life of the house. Mary got help from the physical injuries she sustained, but none for whatever underlying psychological problems made her put herself into high-risk situations. Beyond his wife's occasional injuries, Fred was aware of none of this and wouldn't have acknowledged the effects his particular brand of parenting had on his children, then or later, even if he had recognized them. As far as he was concerned, he had been, for a brief time, faced with the limits of his wealth and power in fixing his wife's near-death health crisis. But ultimately, Mary's medical challenges were a small blip in the grand scheme of things. Once she was on the mend, and his Shore Haven and Beach Haven real estate developments, both phenomenal successes, were nearly complete, everything seemed once again to be going Fred's way. When 8-year-old Freddie Trump asked why his very pregnant mother was getting so fat, talk at the dinner table ground to a halt. It was 1948, and the Trump family now consisted of 4 children, 10-year-old Mary Ann, Freddie, 5-year-old Elizabeth, and 1.5-year-old Donald. Were weeks away from moving into the 23-room house that Fred was in the process of building. Mary looked down at her plate, and Fred's mother, also named Elizabeth, an almost daily visitor to the house, stopped eating. Table etiquette at my grandparents' house was strict, and there were certain things Fred did not tolerate. "Keep your elbows off the table. This is not a horse stable," was a frequent refrain. And Fred, knife in hand, would tap his handle against the forearm of any transgressor. Rob and Donald took over the task when Fritz, David, and I were growing up, with a bit too much enthusiasm. There were also things the children were not supposed to talk about, especially in front of their father or grandmother. When Freddie wanted to know how the baby had gotten there, Fred and his mother stood up as one, left the table without saying a word, and walked off. Fred wasn't a prude, but Elizabeth, a stern, formal woman who had adhered to Victorian mores, very likely was. Oh, for God's sakes. Despite her own rigid views regarding gender roles, however, she had many years earlier made an exception for her son. A couple of years after Fred's father had died suddenly, Elizabeth had become her 15-year-old son's business partner. Wait, I read that correctly, guys. A couple of years after Fred's father had died suddenly, Elizabeth had become her 15-year-old son's business partner. No words. That was made possible in part because her husband, Frederick Trump, something of an entrepreneur, had left money and property valued at approximately $300,000 in today's currency. Frederick, born in Karlstad, a small village in western Germany, left for the United States when he turned 18 in 1885 in order to avoid mandatory military service. Oh, so it's a family thing! Oh, that makes so much more sense. Why serve when you can make up a fake fucking medical condition or just flee the country? He eventually made the bulk of his money through ownership of restaurants and brothels. Brothels? This just keeps getting better. In British Columbia, he lit out for the Yukon territories in time for the gold rush, cashing out just before the boom collapsed near the turn of the century. In 1901, while visiting his family in Germany, Frederick met and married Elizabeth Christ, a petite blonde woman nearly 12 years his junior. He brought his new bride to New York, but 1 month after the birth of their first child, a girl they named Elizabeth, the couple returned to Germany with the intention of settling there permanently. Because of the circumstances under which Frederick had originally left the country, he was told by authorities that he could not stay. They had the right idea. Frederick, his wife, now 4 months pregnant with their second child, and their 2-year-old daughter returned for the last time to the United States in July 1905. Their 2 sons, Frederick and John, were born in 1905 and 1907, respectively. They eventually settled in Woodhaven, Queens, where all 3 children grew up speaking German. I mean, for God's sakes, how hard, I know I've already touched on this, but how hard would it have been to just include a goddamn family tree? I mean, at some point, just put the frickin' family tree in here. When Frederick died of Spanish flu, 12-year-old Fred. Does that strike anybody else as just par for the frickin' course on this? I mean, for real. The irony is just bubbling out of this chapter. When Frederick died of Spanish flu, 12-year-old Fred became the man of the house. Despite the size of her husband's estate, Elizabeth found it difficult to make ends meet. The flu epidemic, which killed upward of 50 million people worldwide, had a destabilizing effect on what otherwise might have been a booming wartime economy. No shit. While still in high school, Fred took a series of odd jobs in order to help his mother financially and began to study the building trade. Becoming a builder had been his dream for as long as he could remember. He took every opportunity to learn the business, all aspects of which intrigued him, and during his sophomore year, with his mother's backing, he began building and selling garages in his neighborhood. He realized he was good at it, and from then on, he had no other interest, none. 2 years after Fred's high school graduation, Elizabeth created E. Trump & Son. She recognized her son's aptitude and the business, which enabled her to handle financial transactions for her underage middle child in the earliest 20th century. People didn't attain legal majority until the age of 21. Was her way of supporting him. Both the business and the family thrived. When Fred was 25 years old, he attended a dance where he met Mary Ann MacLeod, recently arrived from Scotland. I guess that would be MacLeod. 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 Tell me, what do you think? I could probably look it up online, but I'm not gonna. Let's see if that drives you crazy. According to the family legend, when he returned home, he told his mother that he had met the girl he was going to marry. Mary had been born the youngest of 10 in 1912 in Tong Village. Oh no, we get another one of these stupid lists of people. I swear, if this turns into another list of people, I'm gonna go crazy. It's to the point where I should have a whiteboard behind me with lines so that everybody can track it, because God knows I need the help. Mary had been born the youngest of 10 in 1912 in Tong, a village on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, located 40 miles off the northwest coast of Scotland. Her childhood had been bracketed by 2 global tragedies, the latter of which also affected her future husband, World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic. Lewis had lost a disproportionate percentage of its male population during the war, and a cruel twist of fate, 2 months after the armistice was signed in November 1918, a ship carrying soldiers home to the island from the mainland crashed into rocks just a few yards offshore in the early hours of January 1st, 1919. More than 200 soldiers of the approximately 280 on board died in the brutally cold waters less than a mile from the safety of Stornoway Harbor. Much of the island's young adult male population was lost. Any young woman hoping to find a husband would have better luck elsewhere. Mary, one of 6 daughters, was encouraged to journey to America, where the opportunities were greater and the men more plentiful. I mean, good for her. I'm kind of glad we didn't get like the full family frickin' lineage there, right? Anyway, to continue. In early May 1930, in a classic example of chain migration, Mary boarded the RMS Transylvania in order to join 2 of her sisters who had already settled in the United States. I see what's going on. She's trying to make this as like glaringly obvious, the irony and the similarities here. That's gotta be it, right? Right? Because, I mean, chain migration, she's probably going to touch on that subject again when Melania comes up later in the book. Be a fun time. Fun time had by all. Despite her status as a domestic servant, as a white Anglo-Saxon, Mary would have been allowed into the country even under her son's draconian new immigration rules introduced nearly 90 years later. She turned 18 the day before her arrival in New York and met Fred not long after. Fred and Mary were married on a Saturday in January 1936. After a reception at the Carlisle Hotel in Manhattan, they honeymooned in Atlantic City for one night. On Monday morning, Fred was back at the Brooklyn office. The couple moved into their first house on Wareham Road, just down the street from the house on Devonshire Road that Fred had shared with his mother. In those early years, Mary was still in awe of her head-spinning change in fortune, both financial and social. Instead of being the live-in help, she had live-in help. Instead of competing for limited resources, she was the woman of the house. With free time to volunteer and money with which to shop, she never looked back, which perhaps explains why she was quick to judge others who came from similar circumstances. She and Fred put together an entirely conventional life with strictly drawn roles for husband and wife. He ran his business, which kept him in Brooklyn 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. She ran the house, but he ruled it, and at least in the beginning, so did his mother. Elizabeth was an intimidating mother-in-law who, during the first few years of her son's marriage, made sure that Mary understood who was really in charge. She wore white gloves when she visited, putting Mary on notice regarding the expectations she had for her daughter-in-law's housekeeping, which must have felt like a not-so-subtle mockery of her recent employment. Despite Elizabeth's hazing, those early years were a time of great energy and possibility for Fred and Mary. Fred whistled his way down the stairs on his way to work, and when he returned home in the evening, he whistled his way up to his room, where he changed into a clean shirt before dinner. Mary and Fred hadn't discussed baby names, so when their first child, a daughter, was born, they named her Mary Ann, combining Mary's first name and middle names. The couple's first son was born a year and a half later on October 14th, 1938, and named after his father with one small change. Fred Sr.'s middle name was Christ, his mother's maiden name. His boy would be named Frederick Christ. Everybody except his father would call him Freddie. It seemed as though Fred mapped out his son's future before he was even born. Although he would feel the burden of the expectations placed upon him when he grew older, Freddie benefited early on from his status in a way Mary Ann and the other children would not. After all, he had a special place in his father's plans. He would be the means through which the Trump empire expanded and thrived in perpetuity. 3.5 years passed before Mary gave birth to another child. Shortly before the arrival of Elizabeth, Fred left for an extended period to work in Virginia Beach. A housing shortage, the result of service members returning from World War II, created an opportunity for him to build apartments for Navy personnel and their families. Fred had had time to sharpen his skills and gain the reputation that got him the work because while the other eligible men had enlisted, he had chosen not to serve, following in his father's footsteps. family traits. Wow. Through his growing experience with building many houses simultaneously and his inherent skill at using local media to his own ends, Fred was introduced to well-connected politicians and learned through them how to call in favors at the right time and, most important, chase government money. The lore in Virginia Beach, where Fred learned the advantage of building his real estate empire with government handouts, was the generous funding made available by the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. Founded in 1934 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the FHA seemed to have strayed far from its original mandate by the time Fred began taking advantage of its largesse. Its chief purpose had been to ensure that enough affordable housing was being built for the country's constantly growing population. After World War II, the FHA seemed equally concerned with enriching developers such as Fred Trump. The project in Virginia was also a chance to hone the expertise he'd begun to acquire in Brooklyn, building larger-scale projects as quickly, efficiently, and cheaply as possible, while still managing to make them attractive to renters. When the commute back and forth to Queens became too inconvenient, Fred moved the entire family to Virginia Beach, when Elizabeth was still an infant. From Mary's perspective, other than finding herself in an unfamiliar environment, things were much the same in Virginia as they had been in Jamaica Estates. Fred worked long hours, leaving her alone with 3 children under the age of 6. Their social life revolved around people he worked with or people whose services he needed. In 1944, when the FHA funding that had been financing Fred's project dried up, the family returned to New York. Once back in Jamaica Estates, Mary suffered a miscarriage, a serious medical event from which it took her months to recover fully. Doctors warned her against further pregnancies, but Mary found herself expecting again a year later. The miscarriage created large age gaps between the older and younger children, when Elizabeth floating in the middle, almost 4 years younger or older than her 2 closest siblings. Mary Ann and Freddie were so much older than the youngest child that it was almost as if they belonged to 2 different generations. Donald, the couple's 4th child and second son, was born in 1946, just as Fred began plans for the new family house. He purchased a half-acre lot directly behind the Wareham Road house, situated on a hill overlooking Midland Parkway, a wide tree-lined thoroughfare that runs through the entire neighborhood. When the kids found out about the impending move, they joked that they didn't need to hire a moving truck. They could just roll their belongings down the hill. All right, guys, we're going to pause there for today. Like I said, keep an eye out for that podcast information. I will do my best to make sure that any of the notes that I have been throwing in on the video version on that ticker end up being spoken aloud, either at the end as an addendum to the podcast, during as breaks, or what, I don't know. We'll figure out format. I'm still kind of working my way through all this, if you haven't noticed. But anyway, thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe, and stay sane, and stay away from that news. Bye, guys.